Yes, welcome here to the next session of 24 Hours of Future Journalism. My name is Hans Davidsen, and I'm a journalist at the daily Danish newspaper Politiken in Copenhagen and have been covering international terror since 9/11, 20 years ago. And I'm also a former fellow here at the Constructive Institute at Aarhus University. And I've been looking into somewhat of a paradox. Is there anything constructive that can be said or done about covering terrorism? Because the sensation I've had for many years is that there is a big paradox in that actually covering terrorism at the extent that international and Danish media does today is part of the problem, because it is actually very often what militants want, both militants of Islamic but also right-wing extremism want to obtain, that media cover this subject as much as possible. And to debate this issue today, I've invited three guests from different parts of the world. If we start with, in the top left corner, we have Didier Loura from France. He is a senior correspondent at the news agency AFP and has been covering for many years security, terrorism, and also geopolitics. In the right corner, we have Thomas Hækhammer, who is an academic at the Norwegian Defense Institute and who has written many books and also have been covering global jihad for many years. And finally, all the way from Wellington in New Zealand, we have Richard Sutherland, who is head of news at Radio New Zealand. And since we have this very great time difference, it's nighttime at your place, Richard, so good evening to you. I would like to begin at your place. And actually, before we start, I would really like to show you a little clip from your Prime Minister's famous speech right after the big terror attack in Christchurch last year. So if we could start out by seeing this, and then we could move on to you, Richard, to hear your perspective.
Assalamu alaikum. On a quiet Friday afternoon, a man stormed into a place of peaceful worship and took away the lives of 50 people. That quiet Friday afternoon has become our darkest of days. Mr. Speaker, there is one person at the centre of this terror attack against our Muslim community in New Zealand. A 28-year-old man, an Australian citizen, has been charged with one count of murder. Other charges will follow. He will face the full force of the law in New Zealand. The families of the fallen will have justice. He sought many things from his act of terror, but one was notoriety. And that is why you will never hear me mention his name. He is a terrorist. He is a criminal. He is an extremist. But he will, when I speak, be nameless. And to others, I implore you, speak the names of those who were lost, rather than the name of the man who took them. He may have sought notoriety, but we in New Zealand will give him nothing.
Richard, I was thinking, could you give a perspective on how the Christchurch case has changed New Zealand, and especially how it has changed media in New Zealand? Because as far as I know, terror has never actually been a problem in New Zealand, right?
That's right, Hans, and thank you for having me. The attacks last March really came out of left field for New Zealand. We are a small island nation at the bottom of the world. We are not used to this sort of thing happening. We see it obviously on our TV screens and listen to it on our radio sets happening in other parts of the world, almost to the point where it becomes background noise, but never did we ever expect it to happen here. And I think if anyone in New Zealand did expect it to happen here, they would have expected it to be Muslim extremists rather than right-wing nationalists, because so much of the coverage of terrorism in this country is obviously focused on overseas terror events, and the high-profile ones that seem to get most of the coverage were of far-right Muslim extremists rather than right-wing extremists. So this happened completely out of the blue. I think one thing that came out of the attack and the aftermath was a heightened understanding, I think, of the wider New Zealand community about the Muslim community here. The Muslim community here is very small. I think it would be probably 1, maybe 2% of the population. And for most New Zealanders prior to this attack, they would not encounter a Muslim in their day-to-day activities. Now, I think it would be fair to say that the terrorist who carried out the attack, he was aiming to sow dissent and unrest and cause as much violence as possible. But I think, and certainly in New Zealand's case, he's done the exact opposite. You will have seen the pictures of the outpouring of grief and sympathy and condolences that New Zealand underwent in the immediate aftermath of that attack. And I think what it has done is it has brought the Muslim faith, the Muslim community in front of a much wider audience in New Zealand than it would have otherwise have had. So I think from that point of view, the terrorists' actions have completely backfired.
But in New Zealand media, did you start just from when it started discussing this? How should we cover this story? How much airtime should we actually give the perpetrator, just as your prime minister talked about in her famous speech?
Yes, so I was actually working for a television station at the time of the attack. It was, we found out very quickly what was happening. And obviously we had to make a very, very fast decision as to whether we would use the live streamed video of the attack that the terrorist had broadcast. Obviously we didn't show any of it, but it was certainly interesting to see that our Australian counterparts ended up using some very small amounts of that footage, and they were punished for it, both by the broadcasting officials here and by public opinion, I think, in Australia, because there was simply no appetite in this country to see that sort of vision. But that was always in the back of my mind right from the minute I found out what was happening. I had to take a moment and go, okay, this is now happening in my country. I need to be very careful about how I report this. I need to be very clear to the staff who are working with me that there are things we will say and we will do, but there are things we will not say and we will not do. And I think the fact that it was happening in New Zealand to New Zealanders certainly changed the lens through which we looked at how we presented this to our audiences. And it would be fair to say that we pulled back on the coverage quite a lot compared to how we would cover, for example, a terror attack in London or Paris or the Middle East.
We'll return to the Brenton Tarrant case in a little while. But Thomas, I would like to ask you, because you have been studying international terror and global jihadi for many years, but as an academic. But I just wanted to read to you a quote that there's this Israeli professor of history called Harari, who writes a lot of books. And I read one recently where he says that the theater of terror cannot succeed without publicity. Unfortunately, all too often media provide this coverage completely free of charge. But I was just wondering if you have ever thought while doing your research about this, how is media covering terrorism, and are we actually a part of the problem of this phenomenon?
Yeah, well, I think this is a question that tends to preoccupy the media itself more than terrorism specialists, and it's partly because this tight relationship between terrorism and the media is very well known among those who study terrorism. The history of terrorism is intimately tied together with the history of the media. It arose in the 19th century as print media developed and grew, and tactical changes in terrorism have tended to follow very closely technological developments in the media. So, for example, in the arrival of television, the development of kind of cameras that could be moved on site, and so on and so forth. So that there is a very close relationship between terrorism and the media is well established, and it's old. Now, so you know, we typically say that you know, there is this symbiotic relationship between terrorism and the media. The whole sort of the central mechanism of terrorism is to achieve outsize kind of political effects through the media, because the physical damage, the objective damage caused by most terrorist attacks is relatively small compared to, you know, say sort of, you know, acts of war or larger, you know, strategic kind of onslaughts. Terrorist attacks are small; they're little kind of you know, pricks, and the way they work is by amplification through the media. Now, you know, why does this persist? Well, it's a classic tragedy of the commons situation, where what's rational for the individual media actor is kind of not rational for the collective. So you know, you cannot ban media from covering terrorism. So everyone's kind of free to pursue it, and since they're in competition, there is not much you can do to rein it in. You know, unless you want to go down the sort of the censorship,
Yes,
slightly sort of
exactly.
authoritarian
We
route.
can return to that, but if I could just,
Can I just add an important point to sort of the academic knowledge of the media and terrorism nexus, which is that we do not know, empirically speaking, what the relationship is between sort of increased sort of attention given to perpetrators and the occurrence of terrorism. And I want to stress this because, you know, there have been several debates like this in the past sort of 5-10 years, where people make assumptions about the relationship. They assume that kind of more attention is necessarily associated with more terrorism, but we don't know that for a variety of reasons. But I don't think we should necessarily take that assumption for granted. So just bear in mind that we don't know what the relationship is, which brings me to the sort of my last point, which is that I think the way the different countries react to sort of major acts of terrorism, they actually it says more about the country itself and the society and the political culture there. So, for example, take Norway and New Zealand. Very, very similar situations. It's very interesting to hear Richard talk about this, because you know, the attack in 2011 struck Norway out of the blue, just like it struck New Zealand. But the two countries reacted very, very differently and handled these situations, you know, in opposite ways, in the sense that in Norway, the perpetrator received quite a bit of attention, and the trial was very open. It was televised, etc., etc. And in neither country, I think there's been, you know, a noticeable sort of effect one way or the other. So if it were true that giving the perpetrator attention would create a lot of terrorism, we would have seen a lot more far-right terrorism in Norway after our you know, process, but we didn't. And so,
well, you actually have seen one case, or one who tried to commit right? Isn't that right, Thomas?
Yeah, sure. There is some, but it's not like there hasn't been a major wave, and these are many years apart.
Yeah.
So the point is, I think the way that we react to these attacks, it actually says more about our own societies.
Okay, I think we should move on now to France, because Didier, you come from the country in the world perhaps at the moment which is the most targeted country of all when it comes to Islamic terrorism. And actually, back in 2015, I was on vacation in Nice, and the newspaper called at night and said, could I go into downtown Nice? And I remember back then when going around and seeing the atrocities and speaking to people at the boulevard or in the center of Nice, of thinking about this, that I was kind of sick of this, of giving so much airtime to a kind of loser type who had driven his lorry through this gathering of people celebrating in the streets. But is there actually any debate in France going on at the moment, or has there been about how to cover terrorism?
Thank you for having me. First, I want to say I really agree 100% with what Thomas just said. I think we need to look at the way societies are looking at themselves and the way they are looking at what's happening to them. As you know, France has been at the center, has been the target of terrorism attacks since the 70s. We had the extreme left, then we had in the 80s, we had the Palestinians attacks, and then after we had the Algerian GIA, and then and so on and so on. So terrorism has become, unfortunately, a part of French history. Like every so often, there is a new attack. Every so often, there is the same debate. Why us? Why are they doing that? Are they doing that because we are powerful abroad and we've got French army abroad in different, external conflict? Or is it just because of who we are? Is it because we enjoy life and sex and drinks and everything? Or is it because of what we do? So this is a question that we have been confronted with for decades. As for your question, I am not aware of a real debate within the French media of whether we should cover it completely differently, and definitely not on the line of the speech of the Prime Minister, which I find quite impressive. But in the same time, to be honest, if you want to talk about this later, I don't think it's doable. I don't think we can in the society.
Why not?
Oh, for many reasons. One is because if you want to fight an enemy, you need to know this enemy. And if you want to know this enemy, you need to be clear that all of this is not the same. Like the assassination of Samuel Paty, the attack in Nice, November 13, is not all the same. These guys are not all just crazy, whatever you want to call them. Some of them have a political agenda. Some of them are merely like religious fanatics. Some of them have a connection with Sham, with Iraq and Syria. Some of them don't. And I think it's very important to understand things if you want to fight against them. And if you want to understand them, then you need to name them. You need to know whether A was in contact with B, how long was, how did he become radicalized? If that's the case, did he have a political agenda? So my job, I believe, is to try to understand the news and then to call Thomas and to have a comment from him to know what he thinks the debate would be and the meaning would be. And obviously not just Thomas, but because, the fact is I'm reading some of Thomas' work regularly. I'm calling, many people to try to understand. And if you want to understand, you have to name. And if you want to name, then, But just to conclude on this, I mean, I don't know the name of the guy who killed Samuel Paty. I can't remember, truly. But everybody knows the name of Samuel Paty. Whether that would be the other way around, would that make the attack more or less efficient, as Thomas said? What kind of empiric knowledge do we have of the connection between the one and the two? I don't know. One thing is sure is everybody knows that you had a teacher who was a really nice guy, who believed in his work, and he tried to do something, and he was killed for that. And do you have to remain silent?
No,
maybe
if I could
not making the act so powerful, you know, it's impossible. Impossible. And sorry,
yeah.
One more thing: media are not the only one. Professional media are not the only one who are spreading the news. If we don't do it, it's going to go on internet, it's going to go on Twitter, it's going to go on Instagram. We are going to be accused of not saying it, and we're going to play the game of the complotism, and you know, so it's there's no way we can just shut up.
No.
And you know.
But if I could take this on to you, Richard, and also to you, Thomas, because I think what from my point of view has been extremely interesting when it comes to the case of Brenton Tarrant and also Breivik in Norway is what were their motives. And my claim would be that this is actually the examples of where it is the ideology of narcissism, people who are really interested in getting attention, and that is their motive more than ideology like 9/11 or and that this brings me, at least as a journalist, into a very big dilemma. But Richard, could you say something about the case of Tarrant? Because do you agree that he was a loser looking to become famous?
Yeah, 100%. And I'm sure that a psychologist would have a field day analyzing him, but he was certainly more of a loser, a loner, someone who was acting for the attention rather than a part of an organized plot to overthrow a government or affect some real change. He was a white supremacist, right-wing, far-right extremist, but he was also a very sad case, a very sad, lonely man. And I think that probably drove him as much as any ideological motives. Just to pick up on some of the themes that we've discussed, I think it's important to note that although our Prime Minister said that she would not name him or speak his name again, the New Zealand media did not take that approach. We treated him like we would treat any other criminal or accused criminal before our courts. We took images of him, we used them where appropriate, we named them where appropriate. We probably didn't name him as often as we would some other people, but I think the way that we handled it was to, rather than treat it as an act of war or an act of terror, we treated it more like he's a criminal. Now his crimes are of an order of magnitude greater than most people who come before the New Zealand courts. But at the end of the day, he was a criminal rather than some terrorist mastermind. And so we treated him as such. And I think in the way that we treated him and the way that we showed him for what he was, which was a very sad little man with some serious issues who carried out a heinous act.
But Thomas, isn't that completely the same story about Breivik, actually, that he would never have committed this if it hadn't been for the attention, that was the motive?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I think the motives are usually complex, not always, but usually complex. And I think in his case, yeah, there probably was a big element of that. But there was clearly also, genuine ideological conviction to keep him going during the preparation process for so long. I think there's a slight danger here of kind of dismissing all terrorists as narcissist deviants. I mean, because then there's a risk of sort of forgetting the ideological motivations and the fact that those ideas are still circulating and can still motivate others. And so yeah, I mean, bottom line is, yeah, there is an attention-seeking element to, I think, to most acts of most perpetrators, that is usually not the whole story. Otherwise, I want to completely sort of echo what Didier was saying about the challenges of containing this, and even the desirability of kind of regulating it. And I completely agree that there are sort of two main issues there. One is that just the from an information understanding the threat point of view, it's in there are benefits to covering terrorism in some detail, so that the public understands the nature of the threat, so that people don't have an exaggerated sense of it, or an underestimate it. And by the way, for people like me, detailed media coverage of terrorist incidents and perpetrators are their goal. I mean, they're an important part of what we base research on. Yeah. But perhaps more important,
would be a problem for your research if we didn't do so much.
I would struggle. Yes. Yeah. The other dimension is sort of what they also touched on, which is that it can backfire politically. So for one thing, how social media, where people can trade information outside of the control of mainstream media. So if, for example, the mainstream media shuts down coverage of certain incidents, you can be sure that clips will circulate on social media, and there will be complaints that the mainstream media are covering things up. And I mean, we've seen that on many occasions. I remember perhaps here in Norway, perhaps the most prominent recent case was that of the murder of the two Norwegian women in Morocco.
Yeah, one was Danish, actually.
Oh, that's true. Of course, yes. Of course. I'm sorry. Our countries are so closely tied that I see as united. But yeah, so where the coverage was understandably measured and respectful, and the mainstream media didn't want to show any pictures of the actual incident, which footage of which circulated online, and there was quite a bit of criticism from the right primarily and unexpectedly that the media didn't let people see the full extent of the atrocity, and that goes, I think, that cuts both ways. So those people who see the kind of the perpetrating ideology as a major problem in society, they will be unhappy if media doesn't cover it. So, for example, typically, the right is very concerned about jihadism, and the left is very concerned about the far right. So if you tone down the coverage of the far right, people on the left are going to say, oh, you're not showing people what a big problem the extreme right is, and you're giving so much more attention to jihadism. There's this political bias, and vice versa. So we have to be really careful.
But Thomas and you other guys, yeah, you wanted to say something, Didier?
Yeah, I think I want to add something about the economic factor of the media. I want to tell you a story. In 2015, I was the news editor for France during the Charlie Hebdo attack. So I was the boss of the whole newsroom. The attack happened at about 10:30 in the morning, and we knew at about 5 or 6 p.m. the name of the Kouachi brothers, who were the two guys who actually attacked and killed the newsroom. So obviously the police asked us not to publish the names, so that the guys would not know immediately that the police were already after them, which of course we did. So we didn't publish it. By maybe 10:30, 11 in the evening, AP, Associated Press, so one of the two top competitors from AFP, published it. Then Le Monde newspaper published it as well. And the next day, I was blamed big time by my company for not releasing the names immediately after AP and Le Monde did it, because we were far behind in the US papers. AP was on top and it was in Paris. So we were playing at home and we lost the game. And I could argue with the CEO saying, look, our sources really thank us for not publishing it. And that was something we had to do. And on an ethical point of view, that was a key thing and blah, blah, blah. Still, there was an element of competition, and there was something that was reproached to me.
But couldn't you, on the other hand, Didier, couldn't you just say, we don't care if others, if in this matter, if we are in a competition, we are doing the right thing. This is our newspapers or our media standpoint that we don't want to use this name. I mean.
Well, yes, of course you can argue, but when you're not the boss, you're not the boss. Okay. I mean, you know, I
just want to show
my CEO, and if we keep disagreeing, then I'm not going to be news editor anymore. Okay. So, I mean, my point is to say, there is an element of competition between media. This element of competition is probably not very sane and not very positive for the way we all do our work. However, it's not possible at the moment to change this world.
Just look at this guy, and I'll tell you something about Danish media, how that we covered his case.
Hello, my name is Daniel Rye. I'm a Danish photojournalist, and one of the reasons why I'm speaking now is that back in 2013, I got kidnapped by the Islamic State on a reportage trip to the northern part of Syria. I was a hostage for 13 months, and
here I just wanted to ask you a dilemma here, because Daniel Rye was in the middle of Islamic State as a hostage, and Danish media made a silent agreement not to mention him in the media while he was kidnapped. And everyone could have said, this is a really, really important and interesting story, so why do we not just write about him or show his case? But actually, I think this is a good example of how media can get together and say, in this case, it would be wrong to mention his case. But Richard, how do you feel about that? Do you agree on that?
Well, look, we had a very similar case in New Zealand, a Red Cross nurse who was taken hostage by Islamic State in Syria quite some years ago, I think 2013 or 2014. And all of the New Zealand media were contacted by our government at the time and asked not to report on this. And we said, okay, fine, we will go and prepare our stories, but we will not publish them, because we did not want to be the people responsible for this woman's demise at the hands of her kidnappers. And so that story was sat on for, I think, probably about 5 or 6 years before it finally came out. So in New Zealand, we have no problem with doing that if we think that there's the greater good to be gained by it. Certainly, we don't let the commercial pressures overtake the need to look after our own people overseas in difficult circumstances.
I want to ask you, Richard, because you have really taken a new stand in New Zealand. You made these guidelines of how to cover the case about Brenton Tarrant, that there was things you weren't going to name. But I was wondering if you could tell about this, because, you know, seen from some point of view, this is almost close to being censorship, right? Isn't it? Or
yeah, well, these protocols really covered the expected trial of Tarrant. because there was a lot of concern at the time that he was going to use it as a platform to spread his ideology. Now, as it turned out, he entered a guilty plea before the trial started, so we never really got an opportunity to put these protocols into practice. But what we were very anxious to do as a media industry here was to make sure that we weren't being used as a tool to basically amplify his ideology. So we came up with some pretty simple, straightforward ways of handling it. We said that we wouldn't reference his manifesto. We wouldn't broadcast any of the imagery or symbols of white supremacy. There are, of course, hand signals that these people use. We were, cropping that out of photos, blurring it, or not using it at all. And so this was really aimed at the coverage of the trial. And as I said, because he pleaded guilty before the trial began, we didn't really get a chance to show that we could stick to these.
But perhaps he pleaded guilty because of the guidelines.
Well, possibly. I suspect that he was actually getting a little bit annoyed that he wasn't getting much attention. It was the middle of the coronavirus was just hitting here. There was a lot of other news, and I actually firmly believe that he thought that he was going to get more attention if he gave this guilty plea and sort of shocked us all with that. So I think that was, again, an example of his narcissism coming through.
But Thomas and Didier, what do you feel about these kind of guidelines for media? Because I've heard a lot of editors and journalists saying this is really, really a very big dilemma, because this is close to being kind of censorship where you are not allowed to actually tell the public what is going on. Thomas, what do you feel about this?
Sure. Well, I mean, as I mentioned before, this is, I mean, how different countries react, it reflects the political culture. And so it's ultimately kind of a political decision how one wants to react to this. There isn't an empirically based and correct way of doing it. And I have a lot of sympathy for the way that the incident was dealt with in New Zealand. I'm just not sure whether it actually works, whether these guidelines actually help contain the problem. As it happens, the New Zealand attack is probably one of the incidents in kind of terrorism in the past decade that has had the biggest ripple effects. There've been several major shootings in other countries that have been directly and explicitly inspired by the Merton Tarrant attack. I mean, the incident we had in Norway last August was directly inspired by that incident. So there's something about the power of the incident itself, the violence itself, that it's kind of hard to mitigate with by tweaking the details of the coverage. Kind of the actions kind of speaks louder than words. And of course, in Merton Tarrant case, it helped that he had a manifesto which spread like wildfire on social media in the months afterward. So it's kind of to say that often it doesn't matter all that much how the media deals with it, but I think it's probably a good thing. It's commendable that this was done in New Zealand, and I think it has other benefits. It probably has other positive political effects in New Zealand, for example, kind of bringing the country together, bringing the media core together, and so on and so forth. I just think we should be careful making assumptions about the actual effects of this.
Okay, and Didier, what do you say? Would this be possible to create these kind of guidelines in France, for instance?
I don't think so. I mean, it's not. We didn't talk before, but I agree with Thomas. I think it's a remarkable endeavor. It would be a nice thing to do. If you try to do that in France, we're gonna have to organize a Grenelle of media, and then we're gonna sit down in a big room like for 3 months and then we're going to have experts trying to come up with a gist of a possible, common statement in which you're going to have like 3 groups of media disagreeing with each other. And at the end of the day, everybody's going to come back to what they were doing before. We in AFP have very strong guidelines. We do think about it. We do have news editors actually, giving not advice, but orders about what we can do and what we cannot do. And we always have in mind that we have a huge impact because obviously as a newswire, we send our stories to so many clients that, we do have an impact, but that's the most we can do. We look at our own house, try to think of the journalism that we want to practice, that the way we want to tell the world to people and what we see and what we understand and who we talk to. And we are aware that we are in the same time extremely powerful and totally useless. Well, that's what I think, at least. It's this mix of very strange thing. We are extremely powerful and totally useless. So yeah, we have to keep thinking about it, but imagining a global media agreement to decide what to say and what not to say will definitely not be accepted by the French public opinion, at least. We would be accused of lying, and that would spread, complotism and this idea that we are all under the control of the government or powerful economic whatever, and that we are playing a game, and there's no way we can fight against this. I mean, it's not new that violence is used as a political tool. That was the case during World War II. That was the case, 150 years ago. So yes, violence is used as a political tool to impress public opinion. Can media change this? No, I think media can.
We've reached the end now, and if we could finish off with some short closing remarks. I mean, in starting with you, Richard, if you were to recommend something to media about how to cover terrorism with the experience that you've had with the Brenton Tarrant case, could you say here at the end what you would recommend?
Well, I think to sum up, I think in the New Zealand case where we came up with these protocols, we weren't just acting out of the goodness of our hearts or through some altruistic motive. We were also being led by our audience's appetite for certain things. We were punished severely every time we named Tarrant on air. We would get all sorts of complaints, angry emails, angry letters. Our audience, and this probably speaks more to the makeup and the state of New Zealand society compared to some other nations, but they did not want to hear or see certain things. Now, we still showed them what we thought they needed to see, but we certainly didn't show them as much as we could have. And when we did go too far in the audience's mind, we were punished for it. So we would lose ratings, we would see readership drop off. So, I mean, although the protocols that we came up with came from a good place, they also came from a commercial audience-centered place as well. We didn't want to annoy our audience to the point where they didn't come to us. And I think that that's something that maybe in the New Zealand situation is unique. Maybe other countries are so polarized that they couldn't do that. But certainly our experience was that there was an appetite up to so far for the information, and then the audience didn't want to know every last detail or every gruesome detail.
Okay. And you, Thomas?
My sense is that kind of the big outlets are already very responsible. Richard and Didier are representatives of very, very serious media organizations, and I think in those organizations, people have are thinking seriously about this and are acting responsibly. I think the problem may be sometimes more on the fringes, kind of more tabloid media, or kind of less serious ones, and then sort of all of media get the blame for what a few fringe actors do. I think on the whole, the situation is quite good. Now, having said that, it's taken some time for these norms to evolve. I remember in the early 2000s, when these sort of decapitation videos were new, they were shown on a lot of TV channels. I mean, for example, the beheading of Nicholas Berg, the Norwegian TV channel TV2 showed that on primetime television in the evening. That would be unthinkable today, because we have learned, and the norms have evolved, and so. And I think they're generally moving have been moving in a good direction.
Okay, and for the closing remark, Didier.
Yeah, I would concur. We've got 30 years ago, when we would publish a photo or a video that would go only to a professional journalist, we would decide to publish it or not. Now, with the internet, some of our products are going automatically all over the place. So, for example, we decided not to republish the cartoons of the prophets a few weeks ago, not because we decide to accept the pressure of the terrorists, but because we know some of our clients in the world are newspapers in Muslim-dominated societies, and that the journalists in these newspapers could be actually attacked and endangered for content that they haven't chosen. So, as a newswire, again, we've got a very, very special position. I think it just comes down to real quality journalism. Every day, you need to re-ask the same question, rethink about it, doubt about yourself, doubt about the purpose of what you do, wonder whether this piece is necessary or not, whether you've got enough sources or not, whether you give actually context. Then you print it or you don't print it. If you don't explain the whole context, if you don't think the job is good enough, then shut up for a while and think about it twice.
Let that be the final remark. I would like to say thank you to all of you, to Richard Sutherland from New Zealand, Thomas Eckhammer from Oslo, Norway, and to Didier Lourat from Paris, France. Thank you so much for an interesting debate. Now let's view the full video with the Danish hostage, Daniel Rye, who has an important message to media in the world.
Hello, my name is Daniel Rye. I'm a Danish photojournalist, and one of the reasons why I'm speaking now is that back in 2013, I got kidnapped by the Islamic State on a reportage trip to the northern part of Syria. I was a hostage for 13 months, and in June 2014, I was released. I came back to Denmark, but I was only home for like 2 months. And then suddenly I got a notification on my phone. And that notification told me that there was just uploaded a video by the Islamic State, a video showing the beheading of the American journalist James Foley. James and I became close friends in Syria. I sat next to him for 8 months, and we had a lot of time to pass while sitting down there doing basically nothing except waiting and hoping. And when I saw the video of James, I, strangely enough, was not sad. I was not angry. I felt some kind of relief. Now James finally found peace. It was a strange feeling like that, but somehow the reason why I didn't react so much was because I kind of knew what was coming to James, because our captors, some of them later known as the Beatles, and of course the guy who beheaded James, the media gave him the name Jihadi John. They told us again and again that the Europeans will go home, but the American and the British hostages will be used as propaganda. And they did not only say that they will be used for propaganda, they told them that they will be put in orange jumpsuits and then they will be beheaded, and referred back to some Western hostages who was beheaded in Iraq by Sarkawi during the American invasion of Iraq. So I wasn't surprised when I saw that video, and that somehow felt a little bit strange. But the reason why I was not surprised was that it has been a part of the Islamic State's propaganda for many years. It has been an idea ever since they captured James, back in 2012, and suddenly they managed to do this video. And after I came home, everywhere I looked, somehow I felt that I saw Islamic State, because all the medias were writing about them, talking about them. But suddenly, when they beheaded James, it was not only everywhere, it was all over the news. And the picture of James in his orange jumpsuit kneeling next to this person dressed all in black with a knife in his hand, it somehow became one of the most recognizable images since the 9/11 attack. So it was really strange to see how the propaganda media center of Islamic State, they knew how they could use a video like this to get attention, and they got attention. Suddenly, it was everything we talked about. And if we look at it from a branding perspective, you cannot, as a normal brand, paying for advertisement and so on, you cannot get so much attention in such a short time as Islamic State got when they killed James, Stephen, David, Alan, and then Peter. And in the end, they started to do propaganda videos with John Cantley when they dressed him in orange jumpsuit, put him in front of a table, and made him act like some kind of TV anchor, some kind of reading their propaganda up, because they knew that everybody would be looking. Now a hostage is reading the news. So they were not stupid, but somehow they understood why and how our media is back in the West and back in the rest of the world. They worked, how our news criterias, how they are working. And that was somehow scary, that they used us as a platform, as a springboard to go on with their goal, which basically is to create a big line, us, or either you're with us or you are against us. So all these things have kind of touched me a lot ever since. And yeah, I have decided to continue as a photojournalist. Recently, I made a book about climate refugees from Malawi, but not a book where I photographed the climate refugees on the move, but I tried to photograph them while they were still at home, battling the changing weather. This case was in Malawi, and I stayed there for about 4 years, photographing this one family and trying to get an idea of not what it would be like when the catastrophe hits, but what do they need, what do they wish for, to make sure that they don't end up in a situation where they are forced to flee. Because after I was a hostage, I really don't hope for anybody to end up in a shithole like I've been in. I think that we as a international community should try to act before shit hits the fan, and try to make sure that nobody has to leave their homes. So maybe it's a little bit idealistic, maybe it's a little bit ignorant, maybe it is, of course. There's a lot of people who are doing news, who is covering all the conflicts. I think it's a bit sad that there not are more of us who actually are trying to dig into the stories that are more long term, more in depth, to try to see how things will go if we do not act. So that's a little bit about my story in 8 minutes. I would love to talk for the next 2 hours about my projects and my time in Syria, but unfortunately, this is a short piece. So if you're more interested, my story has been made into a movie and also a book called The ISIS Hostage. In Danish, it's Do You See the Moon, Daniel? It's a little bit more poetic, but you know, when it goes abroad, people turns up the extreme vocabulary to sell some more books. But otherwise, I'm also made a small TED talk, and and in Denmark, I still do plenty of lectures about what I've been through. So yeah, I've not moved on yet, but I try to both walking around with my story, try not to only give people the face of Jihadi John, but everything there is behind all the evil and how people can manage to survive and overcome the most evil darkness you can imagine. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a continuously good good day and conference. Thank you so much.